Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 24. Today we'll discuss identifying your audience. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need access to your current Project 4 Civic Engagement Argument materials, and you'll also need access to the Venn diagram template available in the Week 13 module. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll review the 3 levels of audience, we'll determine the most appropriate primary audience, and we'll identify key audience considerations. All right, so let's dig in the archives of the concepts we've discussed throughout this semester. You'll recall that when we discussed the idea or the notion of audience, when we did so, we identified 3 different levels of audience. So keep in mind that with audience, it's not just those individuals who are listening to or reading or viewing whatever work it is that you have created, but it's also individuals, as we'll discuss later, who are open to persuasion, who are open to consider whatever it is that you have to say. So in a general sense, you'll recall that that's what audience is. Of course, it's the people who are engaging with your work, but it is also those individuals who are, again, willing to consider whatever it is that you have to say. Now, with that general foundation in mind, recall that there are 3 different levels of audience, primary, secondary, and tertiary audiences. Throughout this course, and gosh, even throughout this lecture, our focus has been and will continue to be primary audience. Now, those are the individuals who can directly act on whatever argument it is that you are suggesting. So if you say, we should have a later start time for elementary and middle schoolers. So members of your primary audience in that case might be members of the school board or members of state-level organizations and bodies that oversee public schools and perhaps their time frames and when they are in session and are not. So those individuals would be not only those who might be willing to consider your argument, but who can also sort of set the ball in motion, as it were, to get your idea implemented if you're successful in persuading them. Secondary audiences are those who might have an interest in what it is you are suggesting or proposing, but might not have the ability to officially act on it. So for example, if you're, let's say, putting together a proposal or an argument for later start times for elementary and middle school students, if, let's say, the local school board is your primary audience, parents of the students who would be affected might be your secondary audience. So sure, they themselves cannot perhaps change the start times, but they are individuals who are invested in the argument that you're suggesting because that could possibly impact them as well. And then finally, we have tertiary, and those are individuals who it might not apply to their exact immediate situation, and they certainly can't act on it, but they might take some degree of interest. So, for example, if you're writing for, let's say, the Washington County School District, in the St. George area, the superintendent might be your primary audience. Parents of those with students in those schools might be your secondary audience. Well, tertiary audience perhaps might be those who are in Cedar City or Las Vegas. So, if you're successful with implementing later start times, it's not really going to impact them because they don't have students in that area, nor are they the ones who can actually put that action into place. But perhaps those in Cedar City or those in Las Vegas are tinkering around with that idea as well. And so they might read your proposal or your persuasive piece and say, okay, well, this is what someone in Hurricane or St. George has suggested for elementary and middle schoolers. So again, they can't really act on it. It might not have any kind of direct immediate impact, but it might be of interest. So recall that these are our 3 levels of audience, and throughout the semester, and again, also throughout this lecture, we have been heavily focused on primary audiences because we want to ensure that whatever persuasive piece we're putting together, whatever argument we're trying to make, at least gets past the primary audience to be of interest to secondary and tertiary audiences. So, like I had said, we want to consider who the best possible audience is going to be for our work. As I had mentioned on the previous slide, when we consider our primary audience, typically when we think of primary audience, it refers to someone who can, in some way, shape, or form, act upon your argument. So in this case, members of the school board, even the superintendent, or perhaps, depending on how the schools work, the principal and vice principal. So those are individuals who can quite literally put your ideas, into action. However, audience is a little bit more than that. As I had mentioned before, audience also includes those who want to act. If you are trying to persuade someone who is not open to persuasion, who's not open to consideration, who is not willing to work with you as the writer and see how these ideas might play out, then you might as well be talking to a brick wall at that point, and brick walls cannot be persuaded. So at that point, you want to make sure that the audience also includes those who want to act. So at this point, if let's say the superintendent is like, no, we've thought about it, we've done our research, and we're just not interested in extending start times, well, at that point, then the superintendent would not want to act for whatever reason. And so they would no longer be ideal or best possible primary audience, member of the primary audience. So keep in mind, audience is not just someone listening to you, reading your work, or viewing your work. It is also someone who can act, but in addition to that, it is also someone who wants to act or who at least is willing to hear you out. Also, with that, the audience must be open to persuasion to some degree. So even if they are hesitant, even if they express some concern, as long as your audience is open to considering the argument you have and weighing the logic, motion, and authority that your argument has provided, then they still can be a good candidate for being a member of your best possible audience. All right, so sometimes we run into a situation where we have a couple or a few primary audiences that could be ideal for the change that we want to implement or the change that we are arguing for. So there are a few things we want to consider when determining our audience. So for example, let's go back to the start time argument example that I've sort of been threading throughout this lecture thus far. So depending on your situation, maybe the superintendent would be, the local superintendent might be an absolute ideal fit. However, after some research, maybe you find that there are some individuals on the state school board who would also have the same authority to implement the change, or perhaps to implement it on a greater level. So perhaps maybe you say, okay, well, if I want to just contain my argument to the Washington County area, maybe the superintendent is my best bet. But if I want the potential of this perhaps going statewide, maybe those, on Capitol Hill and Salt Lake City are the best people. But all the same, both parties are able to implement your change. Both are possibly open to persuasion, and both can interact with your work, whatever form it's taken. So if they're reading it, listening to it, viewing it. So once you've determined exactly who can and is open to implementing your ideas, you want to start prioritizing those who share your goals and values. So let's say that you are just focused on that you want to prioritize Washington County schools first. Okay, well, if that's the case, the superintendent for that area would be more than ideal because, like you, the superintendent is going to value the well-being and the success of those enrolled in Washington County schools. However, maybe you find yourself saying, no, I want to have this implemented in all schools, public schools in Utah. Well, while the Washington County superintendent, while they also might share that goal, again, their emphasis is more or less on Washington County. And so you say, okay, well, if statewide is my value, then I want to direct my argument at an audience who shares those statewide or state level concerns. And again, maybe I approach someone on the state school board instead. So you want to understand why you're writing, what you want to achieve with that writing, and what values undergird that argument, and then identifying what audience has values that align with those that you've established the most. I'll also say with determining an audience, like I said, the arguments that we're crafting for this course, but I would say just in general, whenever it is you're constructing an argument either in an academic or public setting, you're joining an ongoing conversation, things that people find valuable and interesting and worth discussing and examining in greater detail. And so these types of arguments, especially what you'll be doing for Project 4, is no different. And you want to direct your writing and engage with your writing an audience who can carry on that conversation even in your absence. So for example, if you determine that the Washington County superintendent and their office would be the best primary audience for you to direct your writing towards because of your shared goals and values. You also want to think about how could they carry on this conversation. So maybe your focus right now is on Washington County and you do want to keep it local. But you could also say, okay, well, if I, direct this right out the gate at the superintendent in our area, perhaps when they go to meetings with other superintendents or they're engaged in discussions on a larger state level, they can carry on this conversation in my absence based off of the argument I've provided. So maybe, in this proposal or this argument you've crafted, you find yourself saying, okay, well, students at schools with a later start time typically tend to demonstrate a better ability to focus on certain concepts better than those who start earlier. So because of this argument that you've provided that has been persuasive in its more localized context, so in the Washington County area, maybe the superintendent says, oh yeah, while talking to a superintendent, let's say from Weber or Salt Lake or Davis County or somewhere else in the state, they say, oh, okay, well, I actually received a proposal from a community member, and for later start times, this is how it's worked well for us. These are some of the things that we've had to account for, and these are sort of my thoughts in that, based off of what they've written and what I've seen after it was implemented. And so maybe that persuades those in other districts to implement later start times. So you also want to keep in mind who'd be willing to carry on that conversation that you start, that you implement, and that you really see to grow. Okay, so now let's talk about constructing your audience. Once you've identified, who your primary audience is going to be and who the best primary audience is going to be, we want to think about ways for constructing that audience in a way that allows us to compose most persuasively for them. So some of these concepts we've actually discussed in the earlier lecture, but we're going to add a few layers onto it today. So you first want to define your goals, objective, and purposes for writing. So it's not just, of course, you can start off with, okay, I am writing to persuade the superintendent for later start times for public schools in Washington County. Okay, so your goal is to persuade the superintendent to implement later start times. Your objectives can be maybe more specifically starting an hour later, implementing more late starts throughout the semester, things of that sort. So looking at the more specifics of your argument and your purpose. So why are you writing this argument? Maybe you find yourself saying, you know what, for working parents, having a later start time would just be ideal. It would allow us to spend more time with our family in the morning before going to work, before taking them to school. It would allow our kids to engage in more and participate in more before school programs. Maybe you say, okay, well, I've done the research, and if children are sleeping a little bit longer in the mornings, they're more productive during the day. So what are your specific reasons, or what is your purpose for writing? And so maybe you say, okay, well, based off of those reasons, the purpose could be to promote, more family time at home, to have a less stressful morning on the parents, or to make more productive kiddos throughout the day. So once you've defined those goals and you know where you are coming from as a writer, you know your argument, you know what you want to come of it, and you know why you're writing, you then want to understand who can act on your argument. So this is where you go through and you think, okay, while writing to the PTA might be helpful and it might be a good opportunity to receive feedback on these ideas, the PTA cannot implement my argument. They cannot implement later start times for the schools. And so while they might be a really good secondary audience, again, because of their inability to officially act or share that potential to act in a way that other audiences could, you want to still keep considering who you might direct your writing towards. So again, maybe you say, okay, well, the Washington County Superintendent, that individual can act, their office can act, they have the authority to see this change through if I make my case well enough. So, after you have understood who can act on your argument, and remember, we want to layer that. It's not, again, just who can act, but who wants to act as well. But once you've identified that individual or that group or that body of people, you want to carefully analyze the values and ideologies of your audience. And so this is where we start to say, okay, well, we can assume that the superintendent for this area values children who are healthy and well rested and ready to come to school to be productive and to learn. So those are values, and of course we can assign more specific ideologies to them, but that gives us an understanding of the type of language to use. So to say, okay, well, I know that the superintendent's office has really been pushing for this healthy kids movement, healthy students. So I understand that one of their core values is having students who are not only paying attention in school and retaining the information, but who are also healthy mentally and physically. So understanding that gives you sort of an insight as to how you might persuade them. And then you want to identify areas of overlap. Now, this will help you develop appropriate persuasive appeals. So once you identify what's important to the audience, so again, if the superintendent's office is like, yeah, we want to make sure our students are fit both mentally and physically, and you say, hey, if we push back start time by 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, whatever specifically it is you're suggesting, you can say, hey, superintendent and superintendent's office, I know you value children or you value an environment that fosters the healthy growth and development of the kids in these schools. So to do that better, let's give them more time to sleep in the morning. And so you're starting to see, okay, well, if I know that the superintendent values, having kids who are healthy, I can use that to persuade them on why later start times would be more ideal for this area. So when we think about a visualization, and this is ultimately what you're going to do for the lecture assignment, you want to start to visualize where those areas of overlap are. So if we, on the left-hand side here, we've got our writing objectives, right? So we've got, in this example, argue for more recycling options for Washington County residents, demonstrate how greater access to recycling options could help with quality of life in Washington County. Okay, so that's our objectives. That's why we're writing. That's ultimately the argument we want to make and the stuff that we want to get done with it. Now, our audience, whoever that might be, maybe it is the mayor's office, maybe it is individuals of a certain part of the community, but whoever that happens to be, maybe their values are happier Washington County residents, clean environment for outdoor recreation, clean environment for sustainable living for current and future Washington County residents. So once we've identified what our purpose, goals, and objectives are, and we've identified what our audiences value, and perhaps some ideologies that undergird those values, then we can start to determine what our persuasive appeals will be. So maybe after looking and comparing these objectives with these values, I say, okay, well, I'm going to include statistics about how recycling increases resident happiness. Maybe as you're going through, you find a scholarly article about residents in a particular community in Iowa, and they went from not recycling at all to being, really embracing recycling in every aspect of their life, and residents are self-reporting that they feel significantly happier since the program had started. So you say, okay, this helps me get my point across, but it also speaks to the values that my audience holds. So again, that's where our persuasive appeals begin to emerge. All right, so now let's talk more specifically about the lecture assignment. I want you to think about the argument you'd like to make for project for your civic engagement argument. And I also want you to think about the audience that could likely enact your argument. So that could be, several of you are writing on healthcare. So maybe that might be you're writing to the CEO of an insurance company. Maybe you're writing to a legislature. Maybe you're writing to the board of directors at a hospital. And so once you have done that, I want you to create a Venn diagram, and remember there's a template available in the week 13 module that illustrates your purpose for writing, your audience's values and ideologies, and your possible rhetorical approaches that reflect those values and ideologies. So when we return to this example here, we have our writing objectives, so the argument we want to make and what we could ultimately see coming from it. We've got our audience values, so what they're ultimately looking for just as an organization, as an individual. And then we've started to draft at least one idea of, how we could persuade to our audience, given our objectives and given their values. So for the weekly homework then, you will need to include the core lecture 24 summary and assignment in your week 13 homework submission. Overall, your week 13 homework submission should include the summaries and assignments for core lectures 24 and 25, as well as a mini lecture of your choice. And that's all due to Canvas before 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, November 17th. If you have any questions or you want to chat about these ideas further, please feel free to reach out to me on Canvas. All right, everyone, have a good day.